That's right. We're going to head over to Dallas with Mike Baudendistal, head of Intermodal Solutions. Mike, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
No problem. Good to see you. It is awfully dark and rainy here. I'm glad I don't have to go out and drive in this. Those roads sound pretty bad based on what Kaylee just said.
Yeah, I'm glad you're over here and not flooded out. You're dry and safe there at home. Mike, this morning we're talking about regulations hitting a certain area. When I hear regulations, I start thinking, okay, is this going to be a little bit too bureaucratic? Is this going to slow things down? What's the overall take so far at a high view?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion with railroads and regulations and with the Surface Transportation Board, which is the independent agency that regulates the railroads. And I think what's sort of changed here is a lot of these discussions have moved to the forefront of the business news and political discussions. It was interesting that just yesterday there's this big article about the Surface Transportation Board in the Wall Street Journal, and that usually that's a board. I mean, they called it an obscure agency, and I guess that's because you and I talk about it on FreightWaves Now, and they talk about a railway age and freight waves and all these places, but it's not something that's maybe it's the mainstream news. Similarly, it used to be that one or two senators cared about railroad service, maybe the guy from West Virginia and maybe Minnesota, the big agriculture states. And now it seems like there's senators from all over the country that are upset about railroad service levels being really poor. So I think all these things are important because it's sort of bringing to the public's awareness that maybe part of the reason why their groceries are so expensive is that rail service is bad. I mean, you sort of, can kind of connect the dots if the chicken feed isn't getting to the chicken farms, and maybe that's why my chicken, is more expensive at the grocery store. So all those things, I think, put more pressure on the Surface Transportation Board to do more to protect shippers' interests, and your concern that the Surface Transportation Board or other regulators don't go too far in terms of regulation. I think that's true. I think really the railroads have had a hands-off approach and benefited from a hands-off approach to regulation for some time, and maybe too much so, where it was hard for shippers to, let's say, contest rate cases without a really cumbersome, expensive process. So that's one thing that the STB is looking at, is maybe streamlining that process for contesting rate cases to make it easier for smaller shippers to bring, those rate cases. So far, the Surface Transportation Board has, demanded, additional service data, which is now available on their website. And there's actually some interesting things in there in terms of delay days. They also hit Union Pacific with this emergency order to, restock Foster Farms with animal feed. The chickens I mentioned, earlier. No one wants to see that the chickens, have to be, killed because they don't get enough, food. So those things have already happened. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion of what they could do in the future to protect shippers' interests. I mean, things like, redefining the common carrier obligation, I think, is an important thing, where it's not exactly clear what minimum level of service the railroads have to provide to meet that obligation. And then there's a lot about, reciprocal switching, or maybe there should be some, sort of penalties if the railroads can't meet certain service obligations. I mean, certainly there's penalties on shippers for demurrage if they're, they have the rail cars are, congesting, terminals and those things. So they're trying to, move that to be a little bit more balanced. The railroads say it's all about labor. It's just this tight labor market. If they had the people, they could, improve, service levels. But I think there's a question of whether, the labor shortage in railroads is going to be, long term in nature, because the morale has been poor the last, couple of years.
So, Mike, I see a lot of what's going on with these conversations around rail regulation right now, and it almost kind of mirrors what we saw going on the ocean side of things about 8 to 9 months ago. We know that kind of got somewhat fixed with the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, but because of the way that the rail system is set up, there's already some kind of pre-existing regulation and almost some pre-existing oversight over the way that the rails work, right? Could we be seeing a type of similar, not necessarily like the same, but a similar type of approach when it comes to fixing service issues on the rails as we did at the ports, or is that just two completely different things?
I think they're pretty different things. I mean, I think with the railroads, they blame so much of the issues on not having the right, people. and not having enough people. Where at the ports they really don't have that same issue because of just how much the ILWU pays. Those workers get paid is really way above, let's say, a market clearing price. But lately, the railroads have not been able to recruit and retain workers, at the specified level of pay. So it's almost a market telling you that either they're not getting paid enough, or the work is too demanding, or it's just that combination of how demanding it is for what they're getting paid. So I think it's a little bit more labor availability on the railroads, and there's a large backdrop of the railroads have really streamlined their operation. I mean, call it precision scheduled railroading or not. There's been a lot of cost cutting and trying to do more with fewer resources, both personnel and equipment. Spending less capital, et cetera, over the last however many years, and that has put the railroads in a really strong financial position. It's also created the impression that maybe they've cut into the bone, have not had enough sort of extra resources for when they do have increases in freight volume. Their ability to handle sort of, let's say, surge in volume is challenged.
And by keeping on that topic of streamlining and efficiencies, where does rail stand in terms of technology and say like the freight tech world, or is there still a lot of efficiencies to be had, or is technology really any type of answer for this when really we got to look at different types of regulations and pretty much a lot of labor situations?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of technological advancements in the railroad industry. A lot of those have to do with safety, things like inspecting the rail cars, the rail wheels. They can do those with devices that you can't do just with a human eye looking at them. There's been a lot in terms of what they call positive train control, which is a way to stop a train when the event of human error. And some of those things can in theory lead to having fewer employees, greater efficiency there. Those are things that the unions really pushing back hard on. Although, this quote that from Jim Foote, CEO of CSX, saying, if we had the conductors, the service would be much better. If you did go from a 2-man crew on a train constant man crew, the person you wouldn't need would be the conductor. You'd still have a locomotive engineer. So in theory, I think that's sort of maybe the implication is that if they relax some of those work rules, that they would have enough people and the service would be better.
All right, Mike, it's interesting to watch for sure, and we're going to continue to follow these developments. Thank you for being here this morning. We'll catch the stock out this afternoon, correct?
Yes, good to see you. Yeah, 1 o'clock Central. Yep.
All right, we will see you then. Right now, we're going to head back over to the wall. We've got our next carrier update of the morning.